September 17th, 1862. The rolling hills and cornfields around Sharpsburg, Maryland, were about to witness the bloodiest single day in American military history. The Battle of Antietam would claim over 23,000 casualties in 12 hours of savage fighting as Union and Confederate armies clashed in a desperate struggle that would determine whether European powers would recognize Confederate independence and potentially end the war before slavery could be abolished. Among the Union officers was First Lieutenant James Alexander Whitmore of the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, a young lawyer from Boston whose journey would take him from the refined drawing rooms of Beacon Hill to the blood-soaked banks of Antietam Creek, where he would make the ultimate sacrifice, defending the principles that had shaped his privileged upbringing. Before the gold bars on his shoulders, before the officer's sword and field glasses, before Sharpsburg claimed him in the desperate fighting around Dunker Church, James Alexander Whitmore was simply Jamie to those who knew him best, a thoughtful young man with a brilliant legal mind and an unshakable devotion to his younger sister, Catherine. Born in 1838 to one of Boston's most prominent families, Jamie grew up in the intellectual and moral atmosphere of pre-war New England, where wealth carried the obligation of service and privilege, demanded principled action. The Whitmore family represented the best of Boston's Brahmin class. Old money earned through shipping and manufacturing, combined with a fierce commitment to education, culture, and social reform. Jamie's father, Judge Harrison Whitmore, sat on the Massachusetts Supreme Court and was known throughout New England for his legal scholarship and his passionate opposition to slavery. His mother, Margaret Cabot Whitmore, came from one of Boston's oldest families and was active in the women's suffrage movement and various charitable organizations that served the city's growing immigrant population. Their Beacon Hill mansion was a center of intellectual and political activity, hosting regular salons where the leading minds of New England would gather to discuss literature, philosophy, and the pressing social questions of the day. Jamie grew up surrounded by conversations about abolition, women's rights, and the moral questions that would eventually tear the nation apart. Figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and William Lloyd Garrison were regular guests at the Whitmore dinner table. Jamie's childhood was marked by privilege, tempered with responsibility. He attended Boston Latin School, where he excelled in classical languages and rhetoric, showing particular promise as a writer and speaker. His teachers recognized his natural ability to construct logical arguments and his gift for persuasive communication. By his late teens, it was clear that he was destined for a career in law and public service, following in his father's footsteps while perhaps surpassing his achievements. But the most important relationship in Jamie's life was with his sister Catherine, born 3 years after him in 1841. From childhood, they had been inseparable companions, sharing a love of books, long walks through Boston Common, and deep conversations about everything from poetry to politics. Catherine was as brilliant as her brother, but as a woman in the 1850s, her intellectual gifts were channeled into more limited outlets: private tutoring, charitable work, and the kind of salon hostessing that allowed educated women to influence public discourse indirectly. The bond between Jamie and Catherine was extraordinary, even by the standards of close-knit families. They were not just siblings, but true intellectual companions, sharing books and ideas, challenging each other's thinking, and providing mutual support through the social pressures of their privileged but demanding world. Jamie would often say that Catherine had the finest mind he had ever encountered, and that he regretted the limitations placed on women that prevented her from pursuing the legal or political career for which she was clearly suited. Catherine, for her part, adored her older brother and took immense pride in his achievements. She had been his closest advisor when he decided to study law at Harvard, his most trusted confidant when he began his legal practice, and his strongest supporter when he became active in Republican politics and the growing abolitionist movement. Their correspondence, when separated by his business travel or her visits to relatives, revealed a relationship of extraordinary depth and mutual respect. Jamie graduated from Harvard Law School in 1860 and joined his father's prestigious Boston law firm, quickly establishing himself as a rising star in Massachusetts legal circles. His specialty was constitutional law, and he wrote several influential articles about the legal questions surrounding slavery and states' rights. He was being groomed for a political career, with talk of a possible run for the Massachusetts legislature or even Congress. But Jamie's comfortable world was shattered by the events of 1860 and 1861. Lincoln's election, Southern secession, and the attack on Fort Sumter transformed abstract legal and political questions into immediate crisis. The war that many had hoped to avoid was suddenly inevitable, and young men of Jamie's generation faced the choice between comfortable civilian life and dangerous military service. Jamie's decision to enlist came after weeks of agonizing consideration. His legal practice was thriving. His family needed him to help manage their extensive business interests, and his father desperately wanted him to avoid the dangers of military service. But the moral questions that had shaped his upbringing, his family's fierce opposition to slavery, his own deep commitment to the principles of equality and democracy, created powerful pressure to serve. The decision became unavoidable in the summer of 1862, when Confederate forces seemed to be gaining momentum on all fronts, and there were rumors that European powers might recognize Confederate independence. Jamie found Catherine in their family's library that evening, reading by the window that overlooked Boston Harbor. Without preamble, he told her of his decision to accept a commission in the Massachusetts Infantry. "I have to go, Catherine," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "How can I practice law and speak about justice if I'm not willing to fight for the principles that make law meaningful? What kind of citizen would I be if I let others bear the burden of preserving the Union while I remain safe in my Boston office?" Catherine had been expecting this conversation for months, dreading it while understanding its inevitability. "I know," she whispered, closing her book and looking directly at her beloved brother. "I've known since Fort Sumter that this day would come. I've been proud of you every day of your life, Jamie, and I'm proud of you now. Just promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back to continue the work we've planned together." First Lieutenant James Alexander Whitmore received his commission with the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry Regiment in August 1862, part of the massive expansion of Union forces following the Peninsula Campaign's failure. His education and social position could have secured him a staff assignment away from the front lines, but Jamie insisted on serving with a combat unit, believing that privilege carried the obligation to share the dangers faced by common soldiers. His letters home during the brief period of training revealed a young man adapting to military life while maintaining strong connections to his civilian identity and his deep relationship with Catherine. He wrote detailed descriptions of Army life, his fellow officers, and the evolving strategic situation. But always, his letters returned to his ongoing conversations with Catherine about politics, literature, and their shared hopes for the post-war world they would help create. Throughout early September 1862, Jamie's letters grew more serious as Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched his invasion of Maryland, threatening to bring the war to northern cities and potentially force European recognition of Confederate independence. The Army of the Potomac, including Jamie's regiment, was rushed north to intercept Lee's forces before they could achieve a decisive victory that might end the war on Confederate terms. Jamie wrote to Catherine about the strategic importance of the coming battle, explaining that everything might depend on stopping Lee's advance before it could reach Pennsylvania or threaten Washington directly. He understood that this battle might determine not just military outcomes, but the entire future of American democracy and the possibility of ending slavery. The two armies converged near the small Maryland town of Sharpsburg, where the Confederate forces took defensive positions along the high ground west of Antietam Creek. The Union Army prepared to attack across open fields and stone bridges that would channel their forces into killing zones prepared by Confederate defenders. Jamie's regiment was assigned to attack the Confederate center, where the simple Dunker Church would become the focal point of some of the war's most desperate fighting. On the evening of September 16th, as both armies prepared for what everyone sensed would be a decisive battle, Jamie found time to write what would be his final letter to Catherine. Using a wooden ammunition crate as a makeshift desk, surrounded by nervous soldiers and the constant activity of military preparation, he began what he surely hoped would be just another in their ongoing correspondence about the great questions of their time. The next day, September 17th, began with Union attacks on the Confederate left flank, followed by assaults on the center where Jamie's regiment was committed to battle. The fighting around Dunker Church was particularly savage, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage despite horrific casualties on both sides. Military records indicate that Lieutenant Whitmore distinguished himself during the assault on the Confederate center, leading his men with exceptional courage when the attack stalled under heavy enemy fire. He was mortally wounded while attempting to rally his troops during the final push toward the church, struck by Confederate artillery fire just as the Union forces were achieving their limited objectives for the day. Jamie's body was recovered after the battle, along with his personal effects, which included a collection of Catherine's letters and the final message he had written to her the night before the battle. Both items were eventually returned to the Whitmore family, along with official notification that their son and brother had died serving his country at Antietam. Before we share Lieutenant Whitmore's final words to his beloved sister, I ask that you take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue telling these essential stories of family bonds, intellectual courage, and sacrifice, ensuring that the experiences of those who fought to preserve our democratic institutions are remembered by the generations they died to protect. What follows are the words of First Lieutenant James Alexander Whitmore in his final letter to his sister Catherine, words written with the knowledge that dawn would bring the test that would determine both his own fate and the future of the democratic principles they had discussed in countless conversations throughout their privileged but purposeful lives.
September 16th, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. My dearest Catherine, tomorrow we fight what may be the most important battle of this war, here along Antietam Creek in the Maryland countryside, that reminds me so much of the landscapes we used to explore during our summer visits to the Berkshires. The Confederate Army has chosen strong defensive positions, and our generals tell us that everything may depend on how successfully we can dislodge them from the high ground they occupy. I'm not afraid, my dear sister, because I carry your love and your wisdom with me like armor, and I know that whatever happens, the conversations we've shared about justice and duty have prepared me for this moment. Catherine, my brilliant sister, I need to begin this letter by telling you how grateful I am for the extraordinary relationship we've shared throughout our lives. From childhood, you have been not just my beloved sister, but my closest intellectual companion, my most trusted advisor, and my dearest friend. The conversations we've had about law, politics, literature, and moral philosophy have shaped my understanding of the world more than all my formal education combined. I know that society has limited the outlets available for your remarkable intellect, and I've always regretted that the accident of your sex prevented you from pursuing the legal or political career for which you are so clearly suited. But Catherine, I want you to know that your influence on public affairs through our conversations and through your guidance of my own thinking has been far more significant than most people who hold official positions will ever achieve. I had to stop praying for a while, final briefing about tomorrow's attack, and time to inspect the men's equipment and speak with them about what we expect to face. They're good soldiers, Catherine, mostly working men from Massachusetts who understand what we're fighting for and why it matters. Several of them have asked me to write letters for them to family members, and I've been struck by how similar their concerns are to my own, wanting their loved ones to understand that this sacrifice has meaning, that it serves purposes larger than personal interest. This experience has reinforced something you and I have discussed many times, that the moral questions facing our nation cut across all social and economic lines. These farmers and laborers from Massachusetts understand as clearly as we do that slavery is a moral abomination that corrupts everything it touches, and they're willing to risk their lives to end it. Their courage has taught me humility about the connection between privilege and wisdom. You know how much I've always valued our discussions about the constitutional questions surrounding slavery and states' rights. Well, Catherine, tomorrow we'll resolve those questions not through legal argument, but through force of arms. It seems strange that issues we've debated so thoroughly in Father's library will be settled by young men with muskets and artillery, but perhaps that was inevitable once peaceful political processes broke down. I've been thinking about our last conversation before I left Boston, when you asked whether I believed this war was really necessary, or whether some compromise might still have been possible. I know you supported my decision to enlist, but I also know you had reservations about the wisdom of settling political questions through violence tonight, on the eve of what may be a decisive battle. I want to share my final thoughts on that question. Catherine, I believe we exhausted all possibilities for peaceful resolution. The Crittenden Compromise, the Peace Conference of 1861, all the various proposals for gradual emancipation or federal compensation, none of them address the fundamental moral question that slavery is simply wrong and cannot be allowed to continue. The Confederate leadership made clear that they would accept no solution that ultimately ended slavery, and we could accept no solution that permanently preserved it. Sometimes, my dear sister, moral questions become so clear that compromise itself becomes immoral. We reached that point with slavery. Any solution that left 4 million human beings in bondage for the sake of political convenience would have been a betrayal of everything our family has believed and everything our nation claims to represent. The men are preparing their equipment for tomorrow's battle, and I can see the Confederate campfires across the creek. There's something both terrible and magnificent about being part of this moment. Two great armies preparing to settle questions that will determine what kind of nation America becomes and what role it plays in the larger struggle between democracy and tyranny that's unfolding around the world. I've been thinking about the conversations we used to have about women's rights and social reform, Catherine, and I want you to know that this war has convinced me even more strongly that your generation of women will play a crucial role in building the post-war world. The courage and competence that women have shown in managing the war effort, in nursing and supporting the troops, in maintaining the home front, has demonstrated beyond any doubt that the arguments against women's political participation are simply prejudice disguised as principle. Promise me, Catherine, that you'll continue fighting for women's suffrage and equal rights after this war ends. Promise me that you'll use the moral authority that our family's sacrifice in this war will provide to advance the causes we've discussed. The same principles that make slavery wrong also make the exclusion of women from political life wrong, and both injustices must be addressed if America is to fulfill its democratic promise. I want to tell you about something that happened yesterday that crystallized my understanding of why this war matters so much. We encountered a group of escaped slaves who had been following our army, hoping to reach free territory. Among them was a young woman about your age who had taught herself to read despite laws forbidding slave education. She asked me about the legal basis for emancipation, whether the president really had constitutional authority to free the slaves, and what would happen to her family if the Confederate Army recaptured this area. Catherine, this woman's questions were as sophisticated as anything we might discuss in Father's library. Her understanding of constitutional law was remarkably sophisticated, and her determination to secure freedom for herself and her family was absolutely inspiring. Meeting her reminded me that the intellectual gifts you and I have been privileged to develop through education and social position are not unique to our race or class. They exist wherever human beings are given the opportunity to flourish. That encounter convinced me that this war is not just about preserving the Union or even ending slavery. It's about creating a society where human potential can be fully realized regardless of race, sex, or social origin. It's about building the kind of America where someone like that escaped slave woman could attend Harvard Law School if she chose, where someone like you could run for Congress, where merit rather than accident of birth determines opportunities. Dawn is approaching, and soon we'll form up for what this day brings. Before I put away this pen and take up my sword, I need to tell you things that I should have said more often, but somehow never found adequate words to express. Catherine, you have been the greatest gift of my life. Your love has sustained me through every challenge. Your wisdom has guided my most important decisions. Your companionship has made every joy more precious and every burden more bearable. Being your brother has been a privilege that has shaped everything good about my character and my understanding of the world. I know that society may expect you to focus on marriage and domestic concerns, but Catherine, I beg you not to let conventional expectations limit what you accomplish with your remarkable gifts. You have one of the finest minds I've ever encountered, a moral clarity that cuts through complexity to essential truths, and a capacity for leadership that could benefit thousands of people if given proper scope. If I don't survive today's battle, I want you to know that I died thinking about our conversations, grateful for the intellectual partnership we've shared, confident that you will continue the work we've discussed. If God spares me and I return to Massachusetts, I'll spend every day of my legal and political career advancing the principles we've agreed upon. Promise me, Catherine, that you'll live fully and purposefully, that you won't let grief become an excuse for limiting your aspirations. Most importantly, promise me that you'll remember that love between family members can transcend even death, that the ideas we've shared will survive whatever happens to us individually, and that the principles we've fought for are larger than any individual sacrifice. I can hear the drummers preparing to beat reveille, and the order will soon come to form up for battle. As I write these final words, I can feel your presence with me, your love giving me courage, your wisdom giving me purpose, your faith in our cause giving me strength to face whatever comes. Catherine, you are the finest person I have ever known, and being your brother has been the greatest honor of my life. Our conversations have prepared me for this moment. Our shared values have given meaning to this sacrifice, and our love will survive whatever this day brings. If this is my last letter, know that I died loving you completely and serving principles we both hold sacred. If I return safely to Boston, know that I'll spend every day of our future together proving worthy of the gift of your sisterhood and working to build the kind of America we've dreamed about in our long talks about justice and democracy. Watch for me, my dearest sister, whether I come home on the train from Maryland or you must wait to see me in whatever comes after this life. Know that the bond between us transcends any earthly separation. Forever, your devoted brother, Jamie. P.S. Catherine, I've left detailed instructions with Father about my legal practice and personal affairs. Please make sure the scholarship fund we discussed for deserving students is established regardless of what happens to me. And please, continue our tradition of Sunday afternoon discussions. Find other young people who share our interests and keep alive the kind of intellectual conversation that has meant so much to both of us.
First Lieutenant James Alexander Whitmore never returned to the courtrooms of Boston. He died at Antietam on September 17, 1862, part of the bloodiest single day in American military history that ultimately ended Confederate hopes for European recognition and marked the beginning of the war's transformation from a conflict about union to a crusade for human freedom. He was 24 years old with a brilliant legal career ahead of him and dreams of public service that would never be fulfilled. His sacrifice, along with that of over 23,000 other casualties during the 12-hour battle, helped preserve the Union and create the foundation for Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Antietam was a strategic victory for the Union, despite its horrific cost. Lee's invasion of Maryland was turned back. European recognition of the Confederacy was indefinitely postponed, and Lincoln gained the political capital necessary to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war's moral character and making European intervention on behalf of the slave-holding Confederacy politically impossible. Catherine Whitmore received word of Jamie's death on September 25, 1862, through an official telegram from the War Department. His personal effects, including her letters and his final message to her, arrived 2 weeks later. She was 21 years old at the time, facing the loss of her closest companion and intellectual partner, while trying to honor the promise she had made to continue their shared work for social reform. Catherine's response to her brother's death was remarkable for its combination of profound grief and determined action. Rather than withdrawing from public engagement, she threw herself into the reform movements they had discussed, becoming one of the leading voices for women's suffrage in Massachusetts and establishing the James Alexander Whitmore Foundation for Legal Education, which provided scholarships for promising students regardless of race or sex. In 1863, Catherine began writing a regular column for the Atlantic Monthly, using her platform to advocate for women's rights, racial equality, and democratic reform. Her writing combined the intellectual rigor of her privileged education with the moral passion that had driven her brother to military service. She became known throughout New England as one of the most articulate advocates for the kind of inclusive democracy that Jamie had died defending. Catherine never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to the reform work she and Jamie had planned to undertake together. She lived to see the ratification of the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race, though she would not live to see the 19th Amendment extend that right to women. Her lifelong work for suffrage was motivated partly by her belief that women's political participation was essential to preventing future wars and building a more just society. The Civil War tested fundamental questions about the nature of American democracy and the meaning of human equality. The answer required the sacrifice of over 620,000 Americans, including thoughtful young men like James Whitmore, who chose to risk everything for principles they believed transcended their personal interests and social advantages. Jamie's letter offers us a unique window into the experience of privileged Civil War officers who fought not because they had to, but because they believed their advantages created special obligations. His words reveal the intimate connection between intellectual conviction and physical courage, showing how abstract principles can motivate concrete sacrifice when supported by deep personal relationships and clear moral vision. What lessons might we draw from Jamie's final communication to his beloved sister? What insights does his sacrifice offer about the relationship between privilege and responsibility, between family bonds and public duty? Perhaps the first lesson concerns the nature of intellectual partnership that transcends conventional social roles. Notice how Jamie consistently treated Catherine as his equal despite the limitations placed on women in their era, seeking her advice, valuing her opinions, and encouraging her to pursue influence beyond traditional domestic spheres. Their relationship suggests that real intellectual companionship can exist across gender lines when both parties commit to mutual respect and genuine engagement. Jamie's letter also reveals profound insights about the relationship between moral clarity and political action. He and Catherine had spent years discussing the philosophical questions surrounding slavery and democracy, but Jamie understood that at some point, discussion must give way to action. His military service represents the moment when intellectual conviction becomes physical commitment. There is also, in Jamie's words, a remarkable understanding of the connection between different forms of social justice. His recognition that the same principles that make slavery wrong also make women's exclusion from politics wrong shows sophisticated moral reasoning that could see beyond the immediate crisis to longer-term questions of democratic inclusion. Perhaps most striking is Jamie's ability to find meaning and purpose even in the face of almost certain death. His detailed plans for Catherine's future activism, his establishment of the scholarship fund, his vision of post-war America, these weren't naive fantasies, but conscious choices to focus on creation rather than destruction, on the future rather than the immediate crisis. His approach to the relationship between privilege and obligation deserves particular attention as well. Unlike many wealthy young men who use their social position to avoid military service, Jamie understood that privilege created special responsibilities rather than special exemptions. He believed that those who had benefited most from American democracy had the greatest obligation to defend it. The Battle of Antietam cost over 23,000 casualties, including thousands who died in the attacks on Dunker Church and the Confederate Center. Behind each statistic was a person like Jamie Whitmore, someone with deep intellectual commitments, dreams for the future, and relationships that gave their sacrifice meaning. Yet their deaths were not meaningless. The freedom and democracy they died defending created the foundation for America's emergence as a beacon of human rights and social progress. Catherine Whitmore understood this truth profoundly. In addition to her suffrage activism and scholarly writing, she became one of the leading advocates for Civil War memorialization, helping to establish monuments and educational programs that would preserve the memory of battles like Antietam. She understood that Jamie's sacrifice required her to contribute to the causes he had died for: democracy, equality, and the expansion of human freedom. When the Antietam National Battlefield was established in 1890, Catherine donated Jamie's final letter and their entire correspondence to the park's archives, believing that their intellectual partnership and his ultimate sacrifice deserved to be preserved as part of the historical record. She lived to see significant progress in women's rights and racial equality, understanding that these advances were part of the legacy her brother and his comrades had died to protect. Dunker Church, where Jamie Whitmore died, has been preserved as part of the Antietam National Battlefield, marked by monuments to the regiments that fought there and interpretive programs that help visitors understand the strategic importance of the battle fought around its simple walls. The site draws hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, many of whom are struck by the peaceful nature of the setting and the difficulty of imagining the desperate struggle that occurred there. Yet beneath the peaceful surface lies the legacy of men like Jamie Whitmore, who gave their lives for principles they believed transcended class interest and personal advantage. Their sacrifice wasn't just about preserving the Union or ending slavery, though those were its immediate results. It was about affirming that democratic institutions are worth defending, that intellectual conviction can motivate physical courage, and that privileged citizens have special obligations to serve the common good. In our current era, when American democracy again faces serious challenges, and our social divisions seem to mirror those of the Civil War period, the example of officers like Jamie Whitmore offers both inspiration and guidance. They showed that preservation of democratic institutions sometimes requires tremendous sacrifice, that abstract principles can motivate concrete action, and that love for family, for country, for future generations can overcome even class interest and personal safety. As we conclude this journey through one family's encounter with America's greatest crisis, we might reflect on the continuing relevance of the values Jamie died defending. The equality and democracy he fought for remain works in progress, still requiring each generation to decide anew what these principles mean and how far they're willing to go to protect them. Lieutenant Whitmore's letter, written in a military camp on the eve of America's bloodiest day, offers us perspective both sobering and inspiring. Intellectual conviction can transcend social privilege. Family bonds can survive even death, and the principles we defend through our choices and actions can outlast our individual lives when carried forward by those whose lives we've touched. Catherine Whitmore lived to be 78 years old, long enough to see women gain the right to vote in several states, and to witness America's emergence as a world power built on the democratic foundations her brother had died to preserve. In her final public address given to the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association in 1900, she was asked what she wanted people to remember about her brother and the Civil War generation. They understood, she said, that democracy is not a gift, but a responsibility, not a privilege, but an obligation. Jamie didn't die because he was forced to serve. He died because he chose to serve, because he understood that those who benefit most from freedom have the greatest duty to defend it. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Jamie Whitmore's story is that meaningful citizenship and meaningful family relationships sometimes require us to move beyond comfortable theoretical discussions to uncomfortable practical commitments. Jamie and Catherine could have spent their lives discussing social reform in their family's library, but Jamie understood that at some point, discussion must give way to action. This understanding of the connection between intellectual conviction and practical commitment offers crucial guidance for our own troubled times. The challenges we face, threats to democratic institutions, growing inequality, social division, the persistence of racial injustice, require the same kind of moral courage that Jamie Whitmore showed at Antietam. We may not be called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice that he made, but we are certainly called upon to move beyond comfortable theoretical positions to uncomfortable practical commitments. The question is whether we have the intellectual honesty to see our responsibilities clearly and the moral courage to act on principles larger than our immediate self-interest. The law offices of Boston still train new generations of attorneys committed to justice. The reform movements of Massachusetts continue to work for social progress, and young people still gather to discuss the great questions of their time with the same passion that Jamie and Catherine brought to their intellectual partnership. In this continuity lies the ultimate vindication of Jamie Whitmore's sacrifice. Not that all the problems he fought to solve have been resolved, but that the democratic processes and intellectual freedoms he died to preserve continue to provide hope for each new generation. If this story has moved you, if it has helped illuminate the relationship between privilege and responsibility, between intellectual conviction and practical commitment, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support enables us to continue honoring these stories of family bonds, moral courage, and enduring commitment, ensuring that the experiences of those who fought to preserve American democracy remain alive in our collective memory, not as distant history, but as vital wisdom for our ongoing experiment in democratic self-government.